If your hydrangea has been sitting in the same spot for 2 summers now, the same size it was the day you carried it home from the garden center, a couple of tired leaves, maybe one lonely bloom, mostly just sitting there doing nothing, I want you to do one thing for me before we start. Stop blaming yourself, and stop blaming the plant. You do not have a brown thumb, and that hydrangea is not lazy. In fact, here is the first thing almost nobody will tell you. A healthy hydrangea is one of the fastest growing flowering shrubs you can put in your yard. When one stalls out and just sits there, year after year, it is almost never the plant being slow. It is one of a small handful of hidden things quietly choking the growth off before it ever reaches the part of the plant you can see. And here is the part that changes everything. Whatever is going wrong, it is not happening up top, where your eyes are. It is happening down in the dark, under the soil, where the roots are. The plant you can see is only ever a mirror of the plant you cannot. A hydrangea grows exactly as fast as its roots can carry water up to the leaves. No faster. So if the top is standing still, it is because the bottom is still under construction. Today I am going to walk you through 15 things that work with that simple truth instead of against it. Not 15 products. Not 15 bottles. Most of these cost you nothing but a change in how you see the plant. And trick number 6. Trick number 6 is the one that sounds so backwards that half of you are going to want to argue with me in the comments. Good. Leave it running. Because number 6 is the single biggest knot holding your hydrangea back. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Let us get our hands dirty. Trick 1. And it is the one the whole video stands on. Stop judging your hydrangea by its top and start reading its roots. Here is why. The growth you see up top always runs about a season behind what the roots are doing underground. The plant builds the engine first, then the body. So when you stare at the leaves for a sign of progress, you are reading last year's news. If you want to know what is actually going on, you have to look where the work is happening. So go out with a hand trowel, pick a spot about halfway between the main stem and the edge of the leaves, and gently open a little window in the soil, just 6 or 8 inches deep. You are not digging the plant up. You are taking a peek. What you are looking for is thin, pale, thread-like roots, feeder roots, reaching out sideways into the soil around the plant. If you see fresh white root tips exploring outward, your hydrangea is winning, even if the top has not shown it yet. If all you find is the same tight knot of roots in the exact shape of the pot you bought it in, well, now you know the real problem. And trick 2 is how you fix it. Trick 2. This is the number 1 reason a hydrangea sits in the same spot for 2 years and never budges, and almost nobody checks for it. The roots are still trapped in the shape of the pot. Think about how that plant grew before you owned it. It spent its whole young life in a plastic container, and when a root hit the wall of that pot, it had nowhere to go, so it turned and started circling, round and round, following the wall. By the time it reaches your yard, that root ball is a tight, matted spiral. And here is the cruel part. If you drop it into the ground exactly as it comes out of the pot, those roots keep doing the only thing they know how to do. They keep circling. The plant is technically in your garden, but underground it is still living inside a pot that is not even there anymore. It never reaches out into your actual soil, so it never gets bigger. The fix takes about 1 minute, and it feels a little scary the first time. Slide the plant out, look at the bottom and sides of the root ball, and if you see roots wrapping in circles, you break that pattern on purpose. With clean fingers or a clean knife, tease the outer roots loose, or make 3 or 4 shallow cuts straight down the sides, and gently fan the bottom open. I know. It feels like damage. It is the opposite. You are telling every one of those roots, the wall is gone, go. Ed Gilman, a tree and root researcher at the University of Florida, spent a career showing that a plant cannot settle in until it regenerates a healthy, outward root system and rebuilds the balance between root and shoot, and it cannot do that while it is still coiled in on itself. Cut the spiral, and you hand the plant back its future. Trick 3, and it goes hand in hand with number 2. When you set that plant in the ground, plant it wide, not deep. The feeder roots that actually pull water into the plant live in the top several inches of soil, where there is air and warmth and life. So dig a hole no deeper than the root ball. You want the crown, the place where the roots flare out into the stems, sitting right at the soil surface or even a touch above it, never buried, but dig it wide. 2. Even 3 times as wide as the pot, and loosen all that surrounding soil so it is soft and crumbly. A deep, narrow hole tells the roots to dive into cold, dead subsoil. A wide, shallow saucer of loose soil tells them to run sideways, fast, into the friendly zone, which is exactly the direction that gets you a bigger plant sooner. Trick 4 is about where you put the water, and this one quietly saves a lot of struggling hydrangeas. For the first 2 years, water the root ball itself, not the whole bed. Here is the thing people miss. A new plant's roots have not spread out yet. They are still packed into that original cylinder of soil it came with. So when you stand there and sprinkle the whole bed, you are watering pounds of soil the roots have not even reached, and the actual root ball can go bone dry right in the middle of a bed that looks watered. So aim low and aim close. Put the water right over the crown and let it soak straight down into that cylinder, slowly, until it is wet deep, not just damp on top. Gary Watson, a researcher at the Morton Arboretum who has spent decades studying transplanted plants, points out that a freshly moved plant only carries a few days' worth of water in its small root system when the weather turns hot. A few days. That is your whole margin. Water the cylinder, keep that margin full, and the plant can spend its energy growing instead of surviving. Trick 5. Now we mulch, but I want you to mulch for a completely different reason than you have probably been told. Everybody says mulch to keep the roots cool. True, but that is the small half of the story. The real reason is that those precious feeder roots live in the very top inch or two of soil, and bare topsoil is a brutal place to be a root. It bakes, it dries, it swings from hot to cold, and worse, when it dries out it goes biologically dead. And a hydrangea does not feed itself directly. It feeds through a living network in the soil, fungi and microbes that break organic matter down and hand the results to the roots. Lay down 2 to 3 inches of wood chips, shredded leaves, or bark, starting a couple of inches out from the stem and spreading all the way to the edge of the leaves, and you are not just cooling the ground. You are feeding that whole underground crew. You are keeping the top inch of soil moist, alive, and busy, which is exactly where your feeder roots want to work. One rule though, and Ed Gilman actually researched the harm of getting this wrong. Keep the mulch off the stem. A ring like a donut, not a cone piled up against the wood. Mulch packed against the stem traps moisture on the bark and invites rot. And you undo everything you were trying to do. Donut, not volcano. Remember that one line, and you are already ahead of most gardeners on your street. All right, trick number 6. This is the one I promised would sound backwards, so here it is, straight out. If your hydrangea is young or newly planted, stop feeding it. Put the fertilizer bag down. The feeding is a big part of what is keeping it small. I know how that sounds. Every instinct you have, every ad you have ever seen, says a struggling plant is a hungry plant, so feed it and it will grow. But walk through what fertilizer actually does. A hit of nitrogen tells the plant to do one thing, fast. Push leaves, push top growth. And that is the exact worst thing you can ask of a plant whose root system is still tiny and still trying to settle in. You force out a flush of big, thirsty leaves, and now those leaves are demanding more water than the little half-built root system can possibly deliver. So the plant stresses. It wilts in the heat. Sometimes it throws the new growth away entirely just to save itself. You paid money to push the plant further out of balance. Remember the whole idea here. The top can only grow as fast as the roots can support it. Feeding the top does not speed the roots up. It just widens the gap. Gary Watson's work at the Morton Arboretum kept landing on the same point. The way to help a plant establish is to steer its energy down toward the roots and to improve the soil it lives in, not to whip the top into a frenzy. So for the first year, maybe 2, feed the soil with a little compost if you like, but skip the fertilizer that screams grow now. Let the roots catch up. Once the plant is established and the roots are wide and deep, then a gentle feed makes sense. Before that, restraint is the fastest thing you can do. If you take one idea from this whole video, take that one. And if you disagree, I genuinely want to hear it below. Tell me your experience. Trick 7 follows straight from 6, and it is going to hurt a little. That first summer, if your plant is trying to bloom, pinch the flower buds off. I can feel you wincing. You bought a hydrangea for the flowers, and here I am telling you to snip them off. Stay with me, because there is real logic to it. A flower is the single most expensive thing a plant makes. Blooming pulls an enormous share of the plant's sugar and energy up and out, into a display that lasts a few weeks and then is gone. In year 1, you do not want that energy going up into a show. You want it going down into roots. Pinch off those first blooms, and you quietly redirect that whole sugar budget underground, into building the very engine that will give you far more flowers, for years, starting next season. It is a small, unsentimental trade. One summer of blooms now for a strong plant that blooms its head off later. If you are patient enough to make it, it works. Trick 8 is one of my favorites, because it is so counterintuitive and it costs you exactly nothing. Do not tie your hydrangea tightly to a stake. Let it move. Let it wobble in the breeze a little. There is a real word for what is going on here. Thigmomorphogenesis. And do not worry about the word. Just love what it means. Plants can feel movement, and they respond to it by growing differently. Frank Teleski, a plant biologist at Michigan State University, ran careful experiments on exactly this. He took young plants, staked some so they could not move, and let others flex naturally, and the ones allowed to sway grew shorter, thicker, sturdier stems, and they built stronger root systems to anchor themselves against that movement. The ones locked to a rigid stake grew tall, thin, and weak, and they leaned on the stake instead of building their own backbone. Read that again, because it is the whole trick. Gentle movement is a signal that tells the plant to invest in roots and in strong tissue. Take the movement away, and you take the signal away. And here is a lovely old piece of folklore that turns out to line up perfectly. Japanese farmers have a tradition called mugifumi, where they literally walk on their young wheat and barley seedlings to trample them a little. For generations, people did it because grandfather did it, and it worked. Now we know why. That gentle stress tells the seedlings to root down hard and grow stout instead of spindly. The old-timers were right. They just did not have the word for it. So unless your plant truly cannot stand on its own, let it feel the breeze. Did anyone's father or grandmother swear by a trick like that? Tell me in the comments. I collect these. Trick 9. Now, I just told you a little movement is good, so let me draw the line clearly, because the difference matters. A gentle breeze is a growth signal. A constant, hot, drying wind is a slow bleed. Those are not the same thing. Here is the mechanism, and it is the heart of why hydrangeas struggle in summer. A hydrangea leaf is big and broad, and it loses water fast through tiny pores on its underside. On a calm, mild day that is fine, the roots keep up, but add blazing afternoon sun and a steady dry wind, and that leaf starts losing water faster than the roots can send it up. The moment that happens, the plant does something clever and costly. It slams those pores shut to stop the bleeding. And here is the catch. When the pores are shut, the plant also stops taking in the air it needs to make sugar. A wilting leaf is a closed factory. No sugar is being made, which means no fuel is going down to build roots, which means the whole timeline stretches out longer. So give the plant morning sun, which is soft and cool, and some shade from the harsh afternoon. Tuck it where a fence, a wall, or a taller plant breaks that steady wind. You are not coddling it, you are keeping the factory open. Trick 10, and now we finally talk about cutting. But you have to know your plant first, because with hydrangeas, one wrong cut can cost you a whole year. There are two families here, and they could not be more different. Some hydrangeas bloom on new wood, growth they make fresh this spring. The panicle types, the ones with cone-shaped flower heads, and the smooth types, like the big white snowball kind. These are your new wood bloomers. For these, you have a powerful accelerator. In late winter, before growth starts, cut them back hard. It feels brutal, but here is the mechanism. Over winter, the plant stashes a pile of sugar down in its roots. Cut the top back to a low framework, and come spring, the plant shoves that entire reserve up through just a few buds. The result is a fast, vigorous surge of thick new stems and big blooms in a single season. On the right type, a hard late winter cut is the closest thing to a fast forward button you have. Just make sure, and I mean sure, you have a new wood type before you pick up the shears. If you are not certain what you have, check your local extension office. Which brings us to trick 11, the other side of that coin. And this single mistake is why more hydrangeas never grow and never bloom than almost any other reason. If you have an old wood bloomer, put the shears down. The big leaf mopheads, the lace caps, the oak leaf types, these set next year's flower buds on this year's stems late in the summer. Those buds ride quietly on the wood all through fall and winter, waiting for spring. So if you tidy the plant up in fall, or give it a cleanup prune in spring, you are cutting off next year's flowers before they ever open, every single time. Then you conclude the plant just will not bloom, when really, you have been removing the blooms yourself, year after year. For these, do almost nothing. Snip a spent flower head just below the old bloom if you like, remove a truly dead stem, and otherwise leave it be. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do for a hydrangea is keep your hands off it. Trick 12 is where the whole philosophy of this channel lives, in one action. Do not feed the plant. Feed the soil around it, out at the edge, where the roots are heading. Once your plant is past that first establishing year, top dress with a 1/2 inch to 1 inch of good compost or leaf mold, and spread it in a ring out around the drip line, the circle under the outer leaves, not piled against the stem. Why out there? Because that is where the youngest, hungriest feeder roots are working, and that is the direction you want to grow the plant toward. Compost does not act like a jolt of fertilizer. It slowly feeds the microbes and, over time, the beneficial soil fungi that live in partnership with roots and effectively extend their reach, pulling in water and nutrients from far beyond where the roots alone could go. I will be honest with you, the way I try to be on this channel, hydrangeas partner with those fungi to different degrees depending on the type, so I am not going to promise you a miracle in a bag. What I will promise is this: a soil that is alive, crumbly, and rich in organic matter grows a bigger root system, and a bigger root system is the only thing that has ever actually made a hydrangea grow faster. Everything else on this list is just clearing the road for it. Trick 13 is really a myth I want to pull out by the root, because you will see it all over the internet. Spray liquid feed on the leaves for instant growth. It sounds high-tech, and it mostly does not work the way they claim. The pitch is that the leaf drinks nutrients straight in through its pores, faster than the roots ever could. But a leaf is built to keep water in, not to let liquid feed pour in. Its surface is coated in a waxy, water-repelling layer, and only a little gets through. The pores everyone points to mainly open and close to manage water and air, not to gulp fertilizer. So at best, you get a tiny, short-lived trace of nutrients, nowhere near enough to build a plant. And there is a real cost. Spraying water on the undersides of hydrangea leaves and then leaving them damp is an open invitation to powdery mildew and leaf spot, two diseases these plants already get. So you trade a nutrition boost that barely exists for a disease risk that is very real. Skip it. The address for feeding a hydrangea is the soil. It always has been. Trick 14. Quick one, because I know the comments are already filling up with kitchen remedies. Banana peel water, leftover coffee, Epsom salt. Let me be fair to them and honest about them. They are not scams, and folks who swear by them are not foolish. Here is the real story. Banana peels do hold potassium, but it stays locked inside the peel until soil life breaks it down. Soaking a peel in a jar for a few days releases almost none of it, so peel water is mostly just water. Old coffee is mildly acidic and harmless in small amounts, but it is not the nitrogen jolt it gets sold as. And Epsom salt is magnesium, which people reach for the moment they see yellow leaves. But yellowing between green veins on a hydrangea is far more often a shortage of iron, usually because the soil is too alkaline, not a shortage of magnesium at all. Pour on Epsom salt for an iron problem, and nothing improves. You have just added salts the plant did not need. None of these are the enemy. They are just all aimed at the top of the plant, when the real bottleneck, every time, is down at the roots. Compost the banana peel and the coffee grounds, Let the soil do the unlocking, and you get the actual benefit the slow, real way. And trick 15 ties the whole thing back together. Measure success under the ground, not above it, and give the plant the calendar it actually runs on. Gardeners have an old saying for perennials and shrubs. The first year they sleep, the second year they creep, the third year they leap. And it is not just a rhyme. It is exactly the root story we have been telling this whole time. Year 1, the plant looks like it is doing nothing up top, because underground it is quietly rebuilding a root system after the shock of being moved. Watson's research put rough numbers on it. A good-sized plant can take about a year of root regrowth for every inch of stem thickness before it is truly settled. Year 2, the roots reach a tipping point, and you start to see the plant creep outward. And year 3, when the root system finally outgrows what the top demands, the whole thing leaps. The burst of growth that was simply impossible before, because now the engine is finally big enough to drive it. So next spring, do not stare at the leaves and despair. Go dig your little test window again, and if you find fresh white roots spreading out into the soil, you have already won. The top just has not gotten the memo yet. So let me leave you with this. Stop feeding the plant and start building its roots. That is the whole secret, and it is free. Do not try all 15 this week. Pick the 2 or 3 that fit what your plant is telling you. Start there and watch what next season brings. Now I would love to hear from you. Tell me in the comments, is your hydrangea sleeping, creeping, or leaping right now? And which of these 15 are you going to try first? If number 6 made you rethink that bag of fertilizer in your shed, come back next season and tell me what happened, because I have a feeling you are going to be surprised. Here at Golden Harvest, the idea never changes. Feed the soil, not the plant, and the plant will take care of the rest. Thanks for spending this time with me. Now go take a peek at those roots.